Okay, here's a very basic one that gets overlooked all the time. Soldering your electronics. Now, I'm going to try to make this a quick one since you probably landed here in a hurry because you either broke something that needs to be fixed as soon as possible or you spent a lot of money on a kit for a very complicated pedal and you want to hear how it sounds, but only now you just realize you don't know how to, stick all the parts together. It happens. And if you're none of the above, still not a bad idea to go over the basics every now and then, even though you don't need to be an engineer to know how to solder. Surprisingly, you can actually become one without knowing how to do it. I happen to work with a few that can't solder for shit. Hell, this is the first PCB for the first pedal I ever made, and at the time I was well on my way to actually getting a degree myself, though. There's that. Anyway, the basics. First, plug in the iron. I've lost entire days of my life staring at this thing. I always forget to do it. Also, make sure you're using something appropriate for the job. I'm not gonna give you watts. It's up to you to figure out what works best for in your case, but if you feel like you're aiming a 12 gauge at a muskrat, you're probably overdoing it. Next, make sure everything is accessible. This means two things. Number one, don't be a lazy fuck. If something's hitting deep inside some cavity, just take it out and make sure you're able to maneuver around it with the iron so you don't end up burning everything around the part you're actually trying to fix. Number two, remove insulation if needed. Not a lot, but enough to expose the material. Otherwise, you'll end up mixing solder with burnt plastic, creating a resistance of unknown value instead of a decent joint between parts. And if there's already sketchy insulation on the thing, you just cut it off and start over. It's better to lose a 1/4 inch of cable than having to do the whole thing twice. Next, stuff needs to be clean, always. Electronics are often covered in weird shit like dust, old solder, even cooking oil, if we're talking about anything at my grandma's house ever. So choose the right thing for the job and clean whatever's dirty. Most electronics I deal with, I clean with isopropyl alcohol, either by rubbing or using a brush, and that's usually enough to remove your regular old electronics gunk. Another common one is old solder. Take the time to remove it so you can work clean. Add some fresh solder if the old one is too hard to melt, so you don't overcook the whole thing, then use a pump or wick to clean up the area. Then other times you just need to get creative, like when you get to work with some weirdo that coats everything with nail polish to protect it from weather. So you end up using acetone, for example, but then you need to be careful with anything else around the area that can be damaged by it. You get the idea. Next, a kind of optional one. You find a surface that's too shiny or appears to be coated/laminated with something, so the solder won't stick. It's like trying to hang a painting with bubblegum. This happens to me mostly on the back of some guitar pots and the occasional cheap connector. Some guitar tremolo claws are also annoying to solder on for some reason. This also applies to oxidized copper traces and pads on a PCB. Simple solution, sand it or scratch it or whatever you need to do to create a rough surface to help the solder stick. Otherwise, you'll end up overcooking the whole thing with no result other than a broken pot or a molten mess. Next, have a helping hand. One of these things, or hopefully a better one. They're cheap and they'll allow you to use both hands for the actual job, not to mention you won't be burning yourself all the time. Now, another thing I also use a lot are wooden clothespins. You can just put them anywhere and use your pinky or masking tape to holding them in place. It's much faster than using this thing all the time. Next, make sure the tip of the iron is clean. Always. You don't want to add pieces of charred skin from your last attempt to this one. So have a clean iron at all times. I use a damp sponge, not soaked because the thermal shock will wreck the tip, just damp. Another option is using a brass sponge, which is softer than the tip so you won't scratch it, but don't use steel, only brass. Then there's paper towels. Just make sure you do a quick wipe away from the iron and don't burn anything. I did this for a long time, never ruined the tip. Basically treat the iron like you're wiping your own asshole and it should be fine. Now you might have noticed we haven't soldered shit yet. Well, that's because with the right prep, soldering only takes about a couple seconds really. It's all the other things where you usually fuck up. So next, soldering, which consists of two steps. First, more prep. In this case, tinning the parts. I can't stress this enough. Tin the parts first. This means creating a thin layer of tin on the parts that will be soldered together before the actual soldering is done. This way, you make sure all surfaces will accept the solder easier, so to speak, while bringing them up to temperature a bit. Some parts you'll eventually start to notice don't actually need this, but for the time being, it can't hurt. Also, when it comes to cables, this means No loose hairs, just one neatly tanned end with no annoying pointy things sticking out. Then finally, put them together. You heat them both with the iron and then add some solder to it. Remove the iron and leave it alone. Don't linger and cook the whole thing. If you did everything right, this should be in and out in a split second. The solder will attach itself to the already tinned and up to temperature parts in a predictable and controlled way without needing to reapply heat. You want to work in a quick, decided in and out ninja style. Long heat cycles, not good. Extra heat cycles, not good either. Once you're done, you'll let the thing cool by itself and you'll get a shiny and strong joint. It's natural to feel the urge to blow on it like you're about to stuff yourself with noodle soup, but it can make the alloy brittle and weak and you'll probably spit on it too, which means oxide, so just don't. One easy way to avoid this is by gently pressing the iron against your lips for 5 seconds every time you feel like blowing what you just soldered. And there's that. Now, before you ruin something valuable, go practice on something you can throw away. Like a broken pot, a piece of wire, or something. Just do it over and over and over until you feel like you'd get it right every single time in front of a whole stadium before approaching your expensive gear with a hot iron. Or just go ahead and stab a Gibson with a dirty 120 watt iron. I'm not your mother, I did my best, and that's all you get. If you have any questions, ask away in the comments, but before you do that, you'll have to listen to my album, which will be linked everywhere I can. You will be quizzed about it before I answer any questions, and the quality of my response will depend on your answers, so if you value whatever you're trying to fix, at least listen to one song. Alright, rock on London, rock on Chicago. And he walks away. What a fucking douchebag.